Keefe is starting to lose it in court. First, he was caught calling a witness a rat. Then he suddenly stood up, pointed directly at the prosecutor, and blamed him for everything happening to him. But what happened moments before the outburst explains why Keefe was so angry. Let me break it down. Friday, August 21, 2026, wrapped up the first full week of testimony in the murder trial of Dwayne Keefe Davis, and it did not end quietly. The murder trial stemming from the 1996 killing of Tupac Shakur completed its first week Friday, with jurors hearing additional recorded interviews from defendant Dwayne Keefe Davis and witnessing a courtroom outburst directed at the prosecutor. This wasn't a whispered complaint to his defense team. This was Davis standing up, mid-proceeding, addressing the very man building the case against him. Here's how it went down. One of the day's most notable moments came when prosecutors played audio from an interview in which Davis said he expected payment from Sean P. Diddy Combs after the rapper's death. That's already a gut-punch moment for a defendant sitting in front of a jury, hearing his own voice on tape, talking about getting paid off the back of Tupac's killing. But Davis didn't just sit there and absorb it. The second moment came when Davis stood up and scolded the prosecutor. What did he actually say? "I get beat up by the cops. The guy attacked me in here, sent me to prison. This is just wrong, and it's mostly this guy," Davis said while pointing toward the prosecutor. Picture that for a second. A man on trial for orchestrating the murder of one of the most famous artists in music history, standing up in open court, jabbing a finger at the state's own attorney, and framing himself as the victim of a conspiracy that's ruined his life. The prosecutor didn't flinch. He turned it right back around on Davis in front of the jury, saying on the record that he figured Davis was simply upset about being prosecuted for murder, a line delivered dry enough to land as its own kind of mic drop. That single exchange tells you almost everything about where this trial stands. The state is calm, methodical, playing tape after tape of Davis's own words back to him. Davis, meanwhile, is coming apart at the seams in real time, with a jury watching every second of it. And this wasn't an isolated blip. This was the second flare-up of the week. Just days earlier, before the outburst at the prosecutor, Davis had already shown jurors and the courtroom cameras exactly how thin his patience was running. When a witness named James McDonald, known on the street as Mob James, walked into the courtroom to take the stand, Keefe wasn't so sure what McDonald was going to do on the stand. So much so that it appears as though he called the man a feckin' rat under his breath as he entered the courtroom. Under his breath doesn't mean unnoticed. In a room full of reporters, cameras, and a jury sworn to weigh every gesture and word. Muttering an insult at a witness before they've even sat down is the kind of thing that gets picked up and repeated for days. That single week of testimony, a chaotic week in court by every account covering it, has become the defining stretch of this trial so far. It's not just what witnesses are saying, it's how Davis is reacting to it, live in front of everyone. This is a man who spent decades narrating his own version of what happened to Tupac Shakur, in interviews, on podcasts, in a published memoir, always in control of the story, always the one talking. Now he's in a room where he doesn't get to control the microphone. Every time the prosecution plays back his own words, every time a witness he doesn't trust takes an oath, he's forced to sit there, and twice in 1 week he couldn't do it. He stood up, he pointed, he muttered curses at people walking past him. To understand why this moment hits as hard as it does, you have to understand what's actually on the line here. If convicted, Keefe faces life in prison. He's not a bystander watching this trial happen around him. He's watching prosecutors lay out, piece by piece, the very story he spent years bragging about on camera. Keefe regularly bragged about his alleged involvement with the murder in the years after the slaying, and he was finally arrested by authorities in 2023. He's been locked up in the Clark County Detention Center ever since. That's the setup. A man who once turned his connection to a legendary murder into a career. Interviews, book deals, TV appearances, is now sitting in the same room as the family of the man he's accused of killing, listening to his own bragging get read back to him as evidence, and losing his composure in front of the exact jury that will decide whether he dies in a prison cell. The outbursts aren't just embarrassing moments for a defendant having a bad week. They're becoming part of the story of this trial itself. Clips getting shared and gaining hundreds of thousands of views, sparking much discussion online within hours of happening. Every dramatic turn in that courtroom is being dissected by a hip-hop world that has waited 3 decades for this exact moment. The moment Keefe stops being the narrator of his own story and becomes just another man on trial for his life. So how did we get here? How does a man who spent years openly discussing his role in one of music's most infamous killings end up standing trial, stripped of the very confessions that made him famous, snapping at prosecutors and witnesses in front of the jury that holds his future? To get there, we need to go back to the arrest, the confessions, and the years of legal maneuvering that built the case now unraveling him in that Las Vegas courtroom. To understand why Keefe is losing it in that courtroom, you have to understand why the prosecution's case is built almost entirely out of his own mouth. For nearly 3 decades after Tupac Shakur was shot on the Las Vegas Strip, the case sat cold. No arrests, no trial, just theory after theory swapped in barbershops, on message boards, in true crime podcasts. For decades, Tupac Shakur's 1996 murder lived in barbershop theories, podcasts, and YouTube confessions. Now it lives in a Las Vegas courtroom. The thing that changed wasn't new. Forensic evidence pulled from a lab. It was Davis himself talking. Duane Davis is Orlando Anderson's uncle. Anderson is the man widely believed to have pulled the trigger the night Tupac died, and he was killed years before any charges were filed, which meant he could never answer for it directly. But his uncle could talk about it and did repeatedly on the record for money. Davis has openly spoken about his alleged role in the murder of Shakur on multiple occasions, including in various interviews and in his own book, Compton Street Legend, in which he detailed the events surrounding the rap star's death. According to Davis' previous accounts, he provided the firearm used in the shooting of Shakur to his nephew, Orlando Anderson, who is believed to be the gunman responsible for Tupac's murder. That's not a rumor pulled from an anonymous source. That's a book with his name on the cover. Describing the night in detail, he didn't stop at the book. Davis has claimed that he was in a vehicle with Anderson, who since died, and other alleged accomplices at the time of the shooting, which occurred on the Las Vegas Strip, following Mike Tyson's heavyweight title fight against Bruce Seldon. That's the scene everyone's heard about for 30 years. The fight, the brawl at the MGM Grand, where Anderson was jumped, and hours later, a white Cadillac pulling up beside the BMW, carrying Tupac. Now, in front of a jury, prosecutors have been playing back the specific recordings that built this whole case, and one detail in particular keeps surfacing: the Diddy allegations. Duane Keefe D. Davis told police in 2008 about his involvement in Tupac Shakur's shooting, and said Sean Puffy Combs offered to pay for the murders of Shakur and Death Row Records founder Marion Suge Knight. According to testimony from a retired Los Angeles police detective, that detective, whose name came up repeatedly through the trial, described how investigators tried to corroborate it. According to Dupree, Davis also said he could rekindle a relationship with a man named Zip Martin to discuss money that had been given from Sean Puffy Combs to Martin that never reached Davis. Investigators traveled with Davis to New York in an undercover effort to reconnect him with Martin, but Davis instead got referred to Martin's nephew, and the effort ultimately failed because Martin was ill and no longer involved in the business. That's the piece of testimony that jumped out to almost everyone following the case, because it ties Keefe D's account directly to Combs, who is currently serving federal time of his own on unrelated charges. Keefe D's defense has floated Combs as a potential witness in his favor, an extraordinary prospect given that Combs is himself serving a 50-month federal sentence under the Mann Act, with a release date in 2028. Think about how strange that is. The man Davis once accused of funding the plot to kill Tupac is now someone Davis's own defense team considered calling to help him. But here's the twist that makes all of this admissible in the first place. And it's the twist that has haunted Davis's defense strategy from day one. He always believed his confessions were protected, back in the 2000s when he first started cooperating. With investigators looking into unrelated cases, he understood there was a deal in place, a proffer agreement, the kind of arrangement that's supposed to shield someone's statements from being used against them later, so long as they stay confidential. Davis broke that confidentiality himself over and over in interviews, in his memoir, on podcasts. He turned his supposedly protected statements into a career, and prosecutors argued that the moment he went public with them, any shield those statements might have had evaporated. Keefe D's Nevada Supreme Court immunity appeal, the big open question, failed, clearing his memoir and 2008 interview for trial. That ruling is the reason this entire trial looks the way it does. It's why prosecutors could walk into a Las Vegas courtroom and simply hit play on a recording of Davis's own voice describing handing off the gun. It's why the jury hears him talk about expecting a payout tied to Tupac's death. Every word he said for attention, for book sales, for relevance, over the better part of 2 decades, is now Exhibit A against him. That's also arguably the root of the outbursts we just walked through. This isn't a defendant sitting quietly while an unfamiliar case gets built against him by strangers. This is a man watching a story he told, willingly over and over, for profit, get replayed to a jury with none of the swagger and all of the consequence. No book deal, no TV lighting, no control over the edit, just his own voice, flat and recorded, describing a murder followed by 12 strangers deciding what to do with it. And the road to this trial wasn't short or clean. Keefe D. was indicted on 1 count of murder with a deadly weapon by a Nevada grand jury in September 2023. His trial was originally set for June 2024, but has been pushed back a couple of times and is now set to start on August 10. Along the way, he churned through legal representation. At least a 4th attorney in 3 years came aboard just months before opening statements, each new lawyer needing time to catch up on a case that had grown mountains of paperwork, decades of interviews, and a defendant with a documented habit of talking too much. There were dismissal attempts, too. Davis previously attempted to have the charges dismissed, citing the passage of time and alleged constitutional violations. However, his motion to dismiss was denied, and the case remains on track for trial. Despite the delay, every legal door he tried to walk through closed. The immunity claim, denied. The dismissal motion, denied. Evidence suppression fights over a nighttime raid on his home, denied. Judge Kearney sided with prosecutors and said the nighttime raid was warranted, meaning evidence from the raid will be admissible at trial. By the time jury selection wrapped and opening statements began, Davis had lost every legal argument that might have kept his own words out of that courtroom. All that was left was to sit there and listen to himself. Once the legal maneuvering ran out of road, the trial had to actually happen, and it opened almost exactly on the anniversary that's haunted this case for 30 years. The murder trial for alleged Tupac Shakur killer, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, began Monday, and the trial's taking place in a Nevada courtroom almost exactly 30 years. After Tupac was gunned down near the Las Vegas Strip, getting to that opening bell took work most murder trials don't require. Jury selection alone pulled from a massive pool. According to the Associated Press, the jury of 12 and 4 alternates was chosen from a pool of over 100. Prospective jurors who were asked about their favorite books and movies, whether they had listened to Tupac's music, and whether they had strong feelings about gangs. That last question matters more than it might sound. This case isn't just about a shooting, it's about a gang war that had been simmering in Compton and Los Angeles for years, before it spilled onto the Las Vegas Strip. Prosecutors' entire theory of the case rests on that context. Their opening argument laid it out plainly. Prosecutors told jurors Davis ordered the killing as an act of gang revenge after his nephew was publicly beaten. That beating is the hinge the whole night turns on. Hours before the shooting, Davis is the uncle of Orlando Anderson, who had been assaulted by Shakur, and friends in Las Vegas at the MGM Grand Casino after a Mike Tyson fight. Prosecutors argue that assault, caught on hotel surveillance and replayed for years on TV specials, is what triggered everything that followed. Anderson got jumped. Hours later, someone opened fire on the car carrying the man responsible. To build that narrative in court, prosecutors didn't rely on 1 or 2 witnesses. They called wave after wave of people who were either at the scene, investigating it, or embedded in the gang life the case is built on. Through 2 days of testimony, prosecutors called about a dozen witnesses to describe the 1996 confrontation and the gang tensions that preceded it. 8 witnesses were called on 1 day alone, including a forensic pathologist, who testified about the autopsy, and a retired police sergeant, who secured the crime scene's shell casings. Some of that testimony has been almost unbearably granular, the kind of detail that turns a 30-year-old headline back into a real physical crime scene. A former hotel security guard described what he heard from the parking garage that night. 3 to 4, maybe even 5 each volley, he said. It was a series of pops. That's not a dramatized reenactment. That's a man who was standing feet away, recalling gunfire he heard 3 decades ago, now under oath in front of the man accused of ordering it. Then there's the testimony that's arguably done the most damage to any lingering theory, that someone else pulled the trigger, or that Tupac himself knew who did it and simply refused to say. A former police officer testified. Tupac told him he knew who shot him, but would not rat out the shooter. One of the officers who rode with Tupac to the hospital gave jurors a version of that final ride that's since become one of the most quoted moments of the whole trial. A cop who rode with Pac to the hospital after he'd been shot testified that the rapper refused to say who shot him and made it clear his posse would take care of the gunman. That single piece of testimony does two things at once. It confirms what fans have believed for decades, that Tupac died holding on to street code rather than giving police a name. And it quietly reinforces the prosecution's larger point, that this wasn't random violence, it was gang business, handled by gang rules, all the way to the hospital gurney. Then came the witnesses who actually lived inside that world, the ones who knew Davis personally, who'd been on one side or the other of the rivalry the whole case hinges on. A former FBI agent who'd worked gang cases in South Central described arresting Davis years earlier on unrelated drug charges and testified that he arrested Dwayne Davis for drug trafficking in the late 1990s, and while he was investigating gangs and not Tupac's murder, it was known that Davis was a person of interest. Davis said members of the Blood Street Gang saw Orlando Anderson the night of the shooting and attacked him because of a previous incident at a mall. Death Row Records' own former head of security took the stand too, placing himself at the club Tupac had been heading to that night. Reggie Wright Jr., former chief of security for Death Row Records, told jurors he was at Club 662 the night of the shooting and did not know about Shakur's movements. It's a small line, but it carries weight. One of the people closest to Death Row's inner circle, under oath, distancing himself from any advanced knowledge of what was about to happen just blocks away. By the time all of that testimony landed, the state had built something much bigger than a single shooting. They'd built a timeline of a rivalry, the mall altercation, the MGM Grand beatdown, the drive down the strip, the white Cadillac, the shots, the silence in the hospital. Every witness added another layer to a story that, until now, had only ever been told by Davis himself, on his own terms, for his own profit. That's precisely why this next phase of the trial has been so combustible. Because the moment prosecutors started calling witnesses from Davis's own world, men who ran in the same gang circles, who knew him personally, who'd spent decades either protecting him or resenting him, the courtroom stopped being about tape recordings and turned into something much more volatile. It turned into old rivalries, sitting a few feet apart, forced to answer questions under oath. And that's exactly where things got messy. If the recorded confessions were the foundation of this trial, the live witnesses have been the fuse. And nobody lit that fuse hotter than James McDonald, the man known on the street as Mob James. McDonald is a former Mob Piru Bloods member, tied closely to the Death Row Records world. Tupac moved in during his final months. Prosecutors called him expecting a cooperating witness. What they got instead was someone who spent his entire testimony trying to give as little as possible. The former Mob Piru Bloods member and Death Row associate, testifying as a prosecution witness, repeatedly refused to provide the specific identification that prosecutors sought. The defense saw an opening and pushed hard, hammering him again and again on whether he'd actually seen who fired the fatal shots. Mob James was getting riled up because the defense lawyer for Keefe kept asking him if he saw the person that shot Tupac. "I don't want to send him to prison, even though we don't like each other." McDonald said, "Read that line again." A witness for the prosecution, openly telling the courtroom he doesn't even like the man on trial, and still refusing to hand prosecutors the identification they clearly wanted. That's not typical courtroom behavior, that's decades of street code, showing up in a modern legal proceeding, live on camera. And it's exactly the kind of witness who was walking past Davis when he reportedly muttered that slur under his breath, because as far as Davis was concerned, McDonald's loyalty was never guaranteed. And he wasn't wrong to worry. He just couldn't keep the worry to himself. McDonald wasn't the only wild card connected to Death Row. Still shadowing this trial from outside the courtroom, Suge Knight, the man who was literally driving the car Tupac was riding in when the shots hit, has been serving a lengthy prison sentence of his own for an unrelated case for years, and he's been watching this trial unfold from behind bars in California. Sources close to him say he's been vocal about it, insisting Davis wasn't the only person involved. in what happened that night and suggesting some of the testimony being given isn't accurate. Whether or not any of that ever makes it into the trial record, it's a reminder that almost every major figure from that era of death row records is either dead, imprisoned, or testifying. There's no clean, neutral voice left in this story. Then there's the moment that had nothing to do with testimony at all, and still managed to rattle everyone in that courthouse. On the trial's second day, right around lunch, as Tupac's own family was stepping out of the building, police got calls about gunfire just blocks away. Moments after the family left in a vehicle, 6 police officers ran down the street as a heavy law enforcement presence descended on downtown Las Vegas following reports of gunfire, with several more officers arriving at the scene, one holding a large weapon. After several calls came into dispatch about shots, reportedly heard inside a business in the 500 block of Casino Center Boulevard near Bonneville Street. For a few tense minutes, nobody knew what was happening, or whether it connected to the trial in any way. It didn't take long to get an answer, but the coincidence in timing was jarring enough to send a ripple through everyone covering the case. Officers responding to the reports were unable to locate a victim or confirm a shooting scene. The report had come from inside a nearby Starbucks, and by the time police cleared the area, there was no evidence anyone had actually been hurt. Tupac's sister addressed it directly, making clear the two things weren't connected. She released a statement on behalf of the Shakur family, stressing that the incident had nothing to do with Tupac or the ongoing trial, and called on media outlets to continue covering the case responsibly and accurately, as the family seeks justice for Tupac's life and legacy. Before all that unfolded, she'd taken a moment outside the courthouse to thank the reporters who'd shown up day after day to cover it, saying simply, "Thank you so much for being here, for covering this." It's worth sitting with that image for a second. Tupac's family walking out of a courtroom that had minutes earlier shown them autopsy photos of their brother, only to have police cars come flying down the street behind them over an unrelated report. Several family members stepped out before prosecutors showed graphic autopsy photos of the rapper to the jury. That's the emotional weight sitting underneath every single day of testimony. This isn't just a legal proceeding for the people in those front rows. It's the reopening of a wound 3 decades old, live, with cameras rolling, and reporters live tweeting each objection. And through all of it, the reactions kept multiplying. Hip-hop media outlets, fans, former associates of both Death Row and the Compton gang scene. Davis came from all of them picking apart every clip. One testimony video alone, showing the tense back and forth with Mob James, gained hundreds of thousands of views within a day and sparked a wide amount of discussion. This trial isn't just being tried in a Nevada courtroom. It's being tried in real time across social media, with every outburst, every reluctant witness, every reported disturbance outside the building becoming its own viral moment. That's the environment Keefe D has been sitting in for over a week straight. Recorded confessions playing on loop. Hostile witnesses refusing to cooperate even when they clearly don't like him. A shooting scare blocks from the courthouse and a jury absorbing every second of it. It's not hard to see, watching all of that pile up, why the man at the center of it started losing his composure in front of everyone. So where does this leave Keefe D? And where does it leave the case? That's finally putting a name to a 30-year-old murder. The trial is still moving, and it's moving on a timeline nobody expected to compress this fast. The trial is expected to last upwards of 4 weeks, with close to 200 witnesses that could end up on the stand. Every one of those witnesses is a potential landmine. Another person from Davis's past who could either back up the state's timeline or, like Mob James, sit in that chair and refuse to give prosecutors exactly what they want. What's already clear is that Davis isn't going to get through this trial quietly. 2 outbursts inside 1 week, pointing at the prosecutor, muttering at a witness under his breath, suggest a man who can't fully absorb what's happening to him in real time. He spent years being the one controlling the microphone, deciding which version of the story got told and when. Now he's watching a jury hear his own confessions get replayed, without any of the context or spin he used to wrap around them. Sources close to him have pushed back on that reading, suggesting his past admissions were exaggerated for attention rather than literal truth. But the jury doesn't get to hear that argument from a source. They only get to hear it from him, if his defense chooses to put him on the stand at all. The stakes on the other side of this couldn't be higher. If convicted, Keefe faces life in prison, which doesn't scare him because he's been in and out of jail for years, though he'd rather not spend his remaining days in prison. One source close to him noted that prison is a dangerous place, especially for someone older, and Keefe is 64. That's not an abstract number. That's a man in his 60s, weighing the very real possibility that whatever's left of his life plays out behind bars, in a system he's already spent years navigating on lesser charges. And even beyond the verdict, there's a piece of this story that's still being written. A production company has already secured access to Davis and his family, building a documentary meant to follow the case regardless of which way the jury goes. Keefe D and his attorneys have been developing a documentary framed to drop win or lose, signaling they see this as a fight over the narrative as much as the verdict. Even sitting in that courtroom, even mid-outburst, part of this is still about controlling how his story gets told once the gavel falls. That tension between the man who spent years profiting off his own alleged confession and the man now sitting silently while a jury decides if those confessions cost him his freedom is the entire story of this trial. For nearly 30 years, the Tupac case has been a story the culture told itself. Rumor stacked on rumor, with no one held to account. Keefe D's prosecution is the first real attempt to convert that folklore into a finding of fact. Every ruling so far has gone against him. The immunity claim rejected, the raid evidence preserved, the trial moving forward exactly as prosecutors wanted it to. None of that means the outcome is settled. Juries are unpredictable, gang-era witnesses are unreliable by design, and a case built on decades-old memory. And second-hand accounts always carries risk for the side trying to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. But what's not in question anymore is the emotional state of the man at the center of it. He is not sitting through this trial the way defendants are coached to. Still neutral, unreadable. He's standing up, he's pointing fingers. He's muttering at witnesses walking past him, and every single one of those moments is happening in front of the 12 people who will decide whether Dwayne Keefe D. Davis spends the rest of his life in prison for a murder he spent years bragging about, until the bragging became the case against him. The trial continues into its second full week, with dozens more witnesses still expected to take the stand, and with a jury that has already watched the accused lose his composure twice in a single week. However, this ends, it's already clear that the version of Keefe D, who once dictated his own story from the safety of a book tour or a podcast microphone, is gone. What's left is a man forced to sit in silence while his past speaks for him. And when the silence breaks, it breaks loud, right there in open court for everyone to see.